Hello and welcome to the National Road Safety Partnership Program webinar, Growing Our Strong Safety Culture, I should say. We had some technical issues on our first recording. It did not record, so we're going at it all over again. My name is Jerome Carslake, and I am the Director of the National Road Safety Partnership Program and its many activities. To find out more, please visit the NRSP website and register for our newsletter or follow us on social media such as our LinkedIn page. Now, today's session is going to go for 60 minutes, and there's going to be an enormous, actually, the entire conversation is going to be a session where you can provide as much feedback as you want, throw a discussion in. And Brett and I were hoping to meet in person, but unfortunately the forces have gone against us with regards to technology. So if you want to throw questions in, as Lisa's already done, chuck them in down the bottom here. We have a number that we're carrying over from the previous one, which we'll throw in as we go along. And there's a chat as well, but please throw your questions in so we actually have a good record of them as well. So now over to our presenter today, our favourite linguist. G'day, Brett.
G'day, Jerome. Good to be here.
So just some background on Brett to give you an idea of just how amazing he is. Brett is the leader of linguistics at SenseMap. He's also a world champion of public speaking and an internationally regarded business linguist, strategist and communication expert. He's acted as a key advisor on language, meaning and structure of some of the most important commercial deals undertaken in Australasia, working with high-profile individuals and organisations to change the way they are perceived, valued and respected. And I must admit, going through this with you, Brett, I've learnt a lot just in language, what it means. Yep. So let's really just kick off first with a little bit of theory. What do you mean by culture?
So when we talk about things as linguists, we always come from what the word means, where it started. And the word culture comes from the Latin cultura. And it always referred to preparing and using land for crops or gardening. So the word cultivate has the same stem and the same meaning. So a culture is always about steps we take to grow something. And that's why to this very day, something grown in a laboratory is called a culture, right? And so one of the things that we're very strong about is that if you understand that a culture is a growth, then it's an organic process. It's always about growing something. We often talk about building a culture. You don't build cultures, you grow them. The problem with the idea of building something is that implies that there's a linear process going on here, that there's a series of steps, and I put this step in, and then I put that step in, and think about a house or something like that, right? You put your framework in, and then you put your foundation down, and then you frame. Culture just doesn't work that way. It's much messier than that. Everyone tuning in who presumably is working in areas of culture, right? You know that. You know it's an organic thing. So this idea that there's a linear process to it, that it's about building, is just wrong. And it's important to understand that, because we always say as linguists, right? If the language is wrong, so is the thinking. So if you're talking in terms of building a culture, then what it means is you're thinking about it the wrong way, and you'll make a lot of mistakes as a result. If you think more in terms of growing a culture, then you're going to understand that the process is very, very different, and you'll have a different set of expectations, and you'll have a different approach to it. To bring it home, right? Imagine if I said I'm going down to the garden to build a lettuce or to build a cabbage, right? You look at me like I was nuts. And effectively, linguistically, that's what we're doing when we say we're going to build a culture. You don't build them, you grow them.
My background is agriculture, and I find that fascinating, because I remember when I was going through uni and we're talking about soil and all this sort of stuff and soil science, it was the same. A lot of reference our lecturers used was we need to build the soil, whereas I think things have evolved on now. There's a focus on, like, we grow organisms, we grow the organic matter that goes into it, and we try and retain the organic matter. As before, we'd burn stuff off and we'd do all this sort of stuff to try and keep as little in there, and it didn't really sort of work very well.
Well, and that's the thing, right? Because the next question is, all right, so if we're growing something, what are we growing? And again, this is where analogies get us into trouble, because we're not growing an inanimate thing like soil, right? Because the way that you grow an inanimate thing like soil, or like a fire, or like a lake, is that you add more to it, right? So if you want to grow a fire, you add more fuel. If you want to grow a lake, you add more water, right? That's how it works. So if you think about that, if I look at what makes up an organizational culture, because that's what we're talking about here, or a safety culture, if I added more values to the culture, does that grow it? Or does that actually just confuse it and destroy it? And I think we can all figure out pretty quickly, it's the latter, not the former, right? So the soil thing doesn't work. You're not growing something like that. You're also not growing a living thing, right? So it's not like a human being, even though people are obviously very much involved. Living things need food to grow. But as living things grow, we change, right? The cells divide, they form new and different cells, and eventually all living things die. I don't want to bring anyone down, but that's the way it is. So
Life
here's
cycle.
the problem. Yeah, your culture, number one, you don't want it to change. Your culture should evolve, but it should be consistent, right? Your culture is one of those things that everyone relies on as a bellwether that just doesn't change that much. It should be at the very core of what you're about. You certainly don't want it to die. So you're not growing a living thing either. What you're actually growing here is an idea. You know, it's a thought, it's a concept, it's a way of thinking and acting that can be shared as common philosophy. And in this sense, it's a way of working. When we talk about organizational cultures, we're really talking about a way of working. We're talking about a safety culture. It's a way of working safely. So you're growing this idea, and ideas need certain things to happen in order to be able to grow. And those are the areas where organizations really start to fall down badly.
I think exactly as we're going to talk around the growing the idea, how you go through the steps of building a culture. And it's like a comment that Marco's just thrown in here. With building a culture takes steps, understanding growing. But if you are starting to grow a culture, but you need to build a starting point. So that's quite I think that's what we're going to draw on right now. Like when you look at the steps, everything that you talk about. So what would be the first sort of step you'd look at?
So I'm going to split this out into two different areas here, right? So I'm going to talk about later on the elements of the culture itself, right? There are four things that make up a culture. And I would argue that in most organizations, three of them are missing. That they try to build a culture around one of the components and one only. But before we get to that, it's important that everyone understands what an idea has to do in order for it to be adopted. Right? So if you think about this way of working, we want people to work safely. We have a certain approach or philosophy built around that. Then we want people to adopt that idea. And if you want people to adopt any idea, there are basically five things that idea needs to do. The first one is it needs to make sense. Now, I know this sounds stupid, right? But people gravitate towards ideas they understand. So your idea of what a safe environment is, of what a safe way of working is, needs to be simple. It needs to be something that is easily understood in order to get traction. And this is important, right? The ideas don't need to be right or wrong in order to grow. They just need to be understood. They need to make sense. So if you think about, you know, the people who gravitate towards, you know, very simple but wrong ideas, and we're seeing a lot of that around the world at the moment, right? It's because that idea was really easy for them to grasp. It was really easy for them to understand. And that's why they started to adopt it. The second thing, sorry, go on, you're going to ask a question.
No, I was just going to say, and I guess on that, the complexity of that idea angle, getting that clarity around it, it's really tough because I guess with an organization, you have so many different people and cultures and genders and all these elements that are flowing into it. So how do you navigate through all those sort of complex parts?
So one of the things is that it always in linguistics, right? It's always about the really basic, simple stuff that sits right at the heart of everything. And these are things that usually everyone just steps over. We're in such a rush to communicate something that we don't take the time to understand what we're trying to communicate. So let's use a very practical and easy example here. The word safety. We want everyone to be safe. How many organizations have actually taken the time to define what safe is? What that means?
Would that be zero harm?
you know that's a trigger for me. Don't start. So I'll get to zero harm in a second. No, so think about it this way. Broadly, the word safety means to protect from harm. right? If you're safe, you are protected from harm. So you should be able to start to see the issues here. What's harm? What does harm mean, right? Because harm, in its broadest definition, which is the one that you would have to assume everyone's going to take if you don't bother to define it for them, the word harm just means any kind of injury, like, or insult, or offense, right? So making me feel bad would be harm. You know, making me feel upset for some reason would be harm. Now, that may be what you want your definition to be, but I suspect in a lot of environments, there's actually a level of harm. There's a cutoff point, right? So if we said, for example, if we meant by being safe that we want everyone to arrive and go home in the same condition, or to go home in the same condition you arrived, that might be one thing. You see, that's an easy idea for me to grasp. Okay, because I know what I felt like when I arrived, and I want to be able to go home feeling just as good. All right, or we might say we don't want any physical injuries at all. All right, we don't want anyone hurt physically at the workplace, because you can't just say hurt, right? If I say hurt, then we're back in this issue of, well, there's mental hurt, there's emotional hurt.
That's what I was about to ask. So what about the internal stuff you can't see?
Well, and this is the point. The starting point has to be, what's your definition of safety? What's safe in your environment, right? I say this to people all the time. All words are contextual. There are no universal meanings. Look up any word in the dictionary and you will find 5, 6, 7, 8 different possible meanings for that word, depending on the context. And that's before you start adding other words to them. So you have to take the time to say, this is what we mean by safe in this environment. And that's what has to be simple. That's what has to be something that everyone grasps and understands very quickly. All right. So look at someone like Donald Trump. He got elected on a very simple idea that people could understand: make America great again. It didn't matter whether it was bollocks or whether it fell apart if you dug into it. People could gravitate towards that and get it. Think back, for anyone who's old enough, like what we are, when John Hewson tried to explain the GST being introduced. Right? Massive fail on television. And for those of you who are young, go and look it up on YouTube. And you'll just sit there going, oh my God, no wonder he didn't win. Because he made it so complicated that no one could actually grasp the idea. And in most organizations, if you look at what we consider our idea of safety, it usually comes in a manual that's about this thick, which I can tell you right now, no one is going to read, including the people who wrote it. So it'll be full of typos for a start. It's got to be something that we can grasp quickly, easily, understand, get around, and be able to start to believe it. But that's not enough on its own. All right. So, and this is a really important part of culture that people often get. Not only does your idea of safety have to make sense, it's also got to be compatible. It's got to be seen as a natural extension of things that your people already believe in, or views that already guide their behavior. In other words, if you want everyone in your workplace to act and behave safely, they have to believe that's important in the first place. This is not something you can educate. I have to fundamentally agree that safety, whatever your definition of it is a good idea. It's something that I try to do outside of the workplace as well, in my own way.
So what would be the crucial thing then? Like with that person, like how do you guarantee or ensure that person has the right sort of, I guess, values?
In the first place, by paying more attention to recruitment. Yeah. And in particular, paying more attention to attitude in recruitment. Most of our recruitment focuses very heavily on skills, very heavily on experience or knowledge, all of which, incidentally, can be taught, can be learned on the job, or learned over time. It's really interesting is that most wise decisions are arrived at because someone acted very unwisely in the past and learned from it. So the skills of and the experience and the knowledge stuff, that's all stuff we can teach, but the attitude stuff less so. Most people's attitudes don't really change unless there's some sort of major event, usually a life-changing event that forces them to reassess their worldview. Now, if you're talking in the context of safety, obviously we don't want that major event, because that's going to be an adverse, it's going to be a bad thing to happen in our workplace in order for them to change their view. These are the people who stick their hand in the machine to clear it out, even though they know they're not supposed to, right? It's because they don't think it will happen to them, because they don't think that those rules apply to them. This attitude area is really, really important. If you don't have people who understand and believe in the concept of safety in the first place, you're already behind the 8 ball. You're already struggling. So it's really important that we pay attention to that when we're recruiting people, when we're hiring them. Sit down and say to them, tell me about safety. Do you think safety is important? How is it important? Force them to explain it. What would you do in order to make sure that your everyday tasks, activities were safe? What would you expect from a safe environment? And ask those kinds of questions and see what answers they give you. See how many boxes they tick for you.
Yeah, and I'm doing this project looking at heavy vehicle toolbox talks, and we're interviewing a number of truck drivers and companies, and I'm just talking to these guys, asking that sort of question. Well, how do you start your day? And this driver said, gets up at 4 a.m. every morning. He walks in, kisses each of his 5 kids on the head, says, I love you very much. I'm going to be safe today. I'm going to make sure I come home in the same condition I left. I'll see you later. I'll see you tonight. And he said he does that every morning, and that then anchors him the whole day through. He's thinking, I'm in the moment. I've got to be focused on what I'm doing. I've got to be mindful of what I'm doing. And it's absolutely fascinating, and just how that really anchored him back to making sure that's how he functions all day.
Yeah. So there's someone for whom safety is entirely compatible with their view of life. Right. Correct. So again, think about people who are anti-vaccination, for example, that you're seeing a lot of at the moment. Now, if you go back, what you'll find normally is that they're not so much anti-vaccination. They tend to be anti-government, anti-control. There's a bigger life view informing that. So the minute a government mandates something like vaccination, what's their reaction going to be? If I don't trust the government, if I don't like the government controlling me, then I'm going to rebel against that. It's got nothing to do with the vaccination itself. My worldview is not compatible with the government telling me to do anything. Vaccination just happens to be one example. It wouldn't have mattered what it was. If they said, that I have to suddenly give way to everyone at every stop, I wouldn't do that either, if that was my way of thinking. So that issue is really important. And again, most recruitment processes do not pay anywhere near enough attention to it. Think about the truck driver. Think about, in a mining situation. Most of the time, these people are not even visible, right? So you're relying on them to follow the rules. They're only going to do that if they think those rules are reasonable.
And there's a comment here that Sue made in our previous webinar. I'll be throwing a few of them in as we go along. So point she made was she really agreed around, in the last 15 years, the zero harm, it's not about safety, it's about HR, which goes right back to that sort of point. Are we focusing on just getting people into the organisation, and here's our posters and our things around the place?
Yeah. So let's tackle this zero harm thing, because I can see you're keen. So, all right, here's the problem with zero harm from a linguistic point of view. Those two words do not belong together, all right? Harm, as we discussed before, literally means any kind of offence, right? So I could say absolutely anything and you could take it the wrong way. Zero is a real number. Zero does mean nil. It's not an approximation. It's not something aspirational. It's as real as 10 or 1,000 or 50 or whatever, right? So put another number in front of the word harm and it sounds equally silly, right? 50 harm, 200 harm. Yeah, we're aiming for 200. We're not going to go beyond that. So it's just not achievable. It sets you up for failure. Those two words, the minute you put them together, you've decided to try and get your people to achieve something that they know they have no hope of achieving. It's actually demotivational. It's dumb, really dumb. And if you really dig into the people who buy into zero harm, what they'll say, oh yeah, but it's just a cute way of saying we want as fewer accidents as possible, or we want to get. Well, then say that, like the road safety people, towards zero. They're not saying zero accidents because they know that's just not feasible. That's not realistic for people. They're saying, well, let's get as close as we can to it. Therefore, towards zero.
Yeah.
Right? If you said towards zero harm, well, then you'd have something that might be worth considering. But without that qualifier, it's just rubbish. So that's my issue with it.
And another point in there, I guess you sort of touched on just a little bit, was in putting that towards zero, the measures, when that sort of, how important is it to have the right sort of measures that sit around culture as well?
Very. If essentially, and we'll get into this a little bit later when we talk about values, or as we would prefer to call them, guiding principles. That's all about behavior. Values are about behavior. Values themselves are actually a framework for decision making. That's what they really are. Number one, they are not aspirational. They have to be real. They have to be things that we live up to every single day. So choose them carefully. Make sure they're things that you can live up to. Don't put things into your set of values or your set of guiding principles that your workplace or your industry doesn't really allow for. Right? And I'll give you an example. Take a word like honesty. Right? If I defined what honesty meant, and if I said, let's say I say honesty means I tell the truth 100% of the time, all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So first of all, can I measure that?
Yeah.
Of course I can. Really easy, right? Have I told the truth as I understood it? Have I done it all the time? Have there been no exceptions? All right, tick all those and we're good. So it's measurable. I can prove that I'm doing it. Now, if I'm a lawyer, is that a reasonable value for me to have? If my job is to defend you and I have to choose between truths, if I have to choose between the information I disclose and the information I don't disclose, because to do otherwise would actually imperil your defense. See, that's not realistic, is it?
Right? That's especially, yeah, that's, I totally agree on that one. I think of so many,
I can't be honest 100% of the time, all the time, right? Or if I'm in a position where I have to respect people's confidences, right? If think about a priest, confession, right? That can't be a guiding principle for a priest either, not with that definition. Do you see what I mean? So you've got to be very careful that you understand that when you set up these values, these guiding principles, that you're setting them up in such a way that they are realistic for the environment you're in. Because when you don't, it's catastrophic. We've seen companies destroyed by the wrong values. And I'll give you an example. Common value that you see all the time is the word integrity. All right. And I have to see if I can quickly find this for you so I can read it word for word. Let's see here. All right. Integrity. So we work with customers and prospects openly, honestly, and sincerely. Right? That's the definition. Pretty good. Sounds all right to me. They're reasonably measurable.
Yeah.
Not
go work for.
Yeah, except that's Enron. Right? That's one of Enron's core values. Now, they clearly did not believe in that. They clearly did not practice that. But one of the issues is that they would share those things with everyone they recruited. And they made the mistake of recruiting a mid-level accountant who actually believed that nonsense. And when she noticed irregularities in the way that Enron worked with their customers and reported things financially, she went to her bosses and said, hey, this isn't right. We've got to do something about this. And her bosses, of course, knew how things really worked at Enron. And they said, don't worry about it. Let it be. Leave it alone. But because she actually believed in integrity and in that definition, and that was the way she operated, she went to the Securities Exchange Commission in New York and told them. And the Enron stack of cards came crashing down. Exactly. Now, and this is something that's hard for people to understand. There is no ideal set of values. Something that the academic world have done a massive disservice with is pretending that there's some sort of ideal that everyone should be aiming at. That there's, values are not good or bad in and of themselves. You are who you are, and the best thing you can do is be true to it. So, if you're a dishonest secondhand car salesman, your best chance of being successful is to be dishonest. It's not a problem as long as you're dealing with equally dishonest customers. It all becomes a game, right? It only becomes an issue when you attract people who are fundamentally honest, and so on, which brings us back to this issue of compatibility, attitudes, matching up, making sure we're recruiting people that are consistent with what we believe in and what we're trying to push in terms of this idea of safety.
And I guess Marco's actually thrown a couple of good comments in there as well. Not many lawyers in heaven, apparently, because it's a good one. But
might be a little bit harsh, Marco.
It might be the ones, the prosecutors, one would hope, might be on the right side as well. I was just reflecting on that part of the world views of people as well. Like, how complicated is it to try and, especially if you move to safety, to get, because organisations, they're so diverse, there's so many different people working in them. How do you capture them all within your value? Like, how do you get them all understanding exactly what you mean?
So again, when you're dealing with your values or your guiding principles, you got to think in terms of, this is how people decide how to behave. That's what they're really there for. So if I've got two options in front of me, right, and both of them stack up equally in terms of all the other criteria, like financial criteria or efficiency or effectiveness, all those kinds of things, right? Then the way I should be deciding which option I go with should be how many values boxes are being ticked by one or the other. What is closer to the way that we believe that we should be working? What is what is closer to our way of working? And even when you've got examples of decision-making points where, say, one option is hugely cheaper than the other one, but the other one actually ticks all of our values boxes, then you should go with the more expensive, because that is fundamentally aligned with the way you work, right? So, because one of the things that happen with human beings is that all of us, and this won't be popular with a lot of people tuning in, but the truth is, all of us, when faced with the right set of circumstances, will forgo our principles for convenience. And we've all done it. We've all done things that we later regretted because at the time it just seemed the easier thing to do, the quicker thing to do, the faster thing, the thing that gets it off our desk or out of our hair or whatever it may be. So one of the things that cultures do is that they put in place processes, systems, things like that to force us to behave a certain way, even when we don't want to. That's actually the purpose of it. So when we talk about how you grow this idea, how you get it to be adopted, not only does it have to make sense, not only does it have to be compatible with the worldview of the people you've already got and the ones that you hire, it also has to be supported everywhere. So not just a matter of putting a poster on the wall, but supported in terms of every system, every process. So think about a common one. Here's a common one where you can see this. If you're tired while driving, you're feeling sleepy, feeling drowsy, pull over and have a rest. Okay? Now that's a simple idea. Most of us get it. But think of the way that that's supported. There are signs on the roadways whenever you start driving any kind of distance out in the country that remind you. They say, feeling drowsy, pull over, have a rest. There are rest areas that allow you to pull in. So you've got somewhere where you can rest that aren't too far apart. Right? So those are examples of systems and processes supporting this idea so that you just can't get away from it, that it's everywhere. So when you look at things like values and guiding principles, the language that defines those things should be everywhere. You should keep running into it, keep seeing it. It should be in every policy. It should be in every process. It should be referred to in every speech made by the CEO somewhere, somehow, some way. It doesn't have to be, hammered in the sense of, we shall now recite our values. It's not that sort of Japanese style of management where everyone's going to sing the company song at the beginning of every day. But you should be getting constant reminders that these things matter and that they're everywhere. So think about it, right? If safety matters, that word safety should be appearing all the time, everywhere. So should all the words that define your version of safety. So if it means, no injuries, or go home safe, go home happy, or, go home at the end of the day, it might be that, right? Those kinds of ideas need to be permeating absolutely everything you do, no exceptions.
I think you made a really interesting point there as well, because like what you're saying, if someone's out there driving and they can pull over rest stops, fatigue and all that sort of stuff, what about the other sort of side of the coin when, say you're driving a quad train or a big truck or those sort of things, or the facilities just are questionable, they're not available for drivers or truck drivers, and because and yet we're setting all these laws and requirements for them. So how fair is that?
Well, exactly. And again, this is the idea of setting people up for failure. If we want truck drivers to pull over and have a rest because they're feeling tired, then that idea needs to be supported everywhere, not just by the governments who manage the roads, by having those rest stops and so on. And as we know, right, if you get into the Northern Territory or out into the outback WA and so on, there's nowhere to pull over on those roads. They go for miles and miles, and they're usually one lane each way. Where are you supposed to take a rest? How does that work, right? When there's a tendency to blame the individual for everything, but the individual actually needs to be supported in order to be able to take these opportunities. If you go a little bit further beyond that, because we've talked about making sense, being compatible, being supported, but it also has to be relevant, right? It's got to be. One of the issues that we have with safety cultures is we're asking people to do things that might equate to being safe in a different environment, but not in theirs. So think about, being safe in the office, for example, is not the same as being safe in the truck. And when you start making your truck drivers adhere to a whole bunch of rules or regulations or ways of doing things that are more relevant to the office than they are to them, and what happens is they sit there going, well, this has got nothing to do with me. And guess what? They don't just chuck out the things that have nothing to do with them. They chuck out everything. They go, this is bollocks, this is rubbish. This is how you lose people. So you want, when you're defining safety, you want a bit of a broad church. You want to have that simple idea that covers the intent of what you're trying to get across. And then you want all your examples to be different. So this is how you be safe in the office. This is how you be safe in the truck. This is how you be safe in the warehouse. There'll be a little bit of crossover, but there'll also be things that are absolutely unique to them. So that relevance idea is really important as well. They have to see how safety relates to their working life and how they can apply it to their jobs. If they can't see that, they're not doing it. And then finally, in addition to being compatible, making sense, being supported, being relevant, it actually has to be beneficial. There's got to be an upside here. Too much of our safety cultures are all about compliance. They're always about beating people down, forcing them to do something. There's no upside. So again, think about that truck driver. We want them to pull over because they're feeling tired. Do they get rewarded for doing that?
No, they're under the.
In most cases, no.
That they feel that sometimes they shouldn't because the COR and all these regulations, but quite often they feel like they're under pressure or they're working to, I guess, a preset conditions. Because one of the things that pops up quite often is the driver going, look, actually, I don't feel tired now. So can't I wait another half hour till I feel tired, or I'm leading into that, or I know my triggers?
Well, and this is the other thing when we talk about being supported. So, it's up to the truck driver to know when they're starting to feel tired. How would they know? Right?
That's a really interesting question.
You went to sleep last night.
Yeah. And
you don't know because you went to sleep.
And I heard a great way of doing an interview the other day. This driver just said, look, he goes, fatigue just doesn't know the time. Like, I can feel like I'm 100%, but then I can start feeling tired. This fellow, I think he's worked out what his trigger is. His left leg just starts moving a little bit, and he goes, all right, I got to pull over and have a bit of a nap. But that's a super professional driver who knows and he goes, I know my body really, really well, and I know there's a couple of triggers.
So again, we're in a situation where these guys have to be supported. They have to see the benefits of doing this. Rewards and recognition have to be there. We tend to we're very quick to punish people for safety infringements. We're not so good at rewarding them when they do the right thing or when they do things the way they should do them. Think about, and we have knee-jerk reactions to things. We tend to do the most obvious thing rather than dealing with the core issue. So think about, again, someone sticks their arm inside a machine to clear it because it's blocked, right? And the machine starts up again and they lose part of their arm, right? We've all heard those stories. So years and years ago, I actually spoke to occupational health and safety inspectors conference. I swear I've never seen more missing limbs in my life. It almost seemed like the way to become an inspector was to do something really dopey where you lost a limb in the first place. But the point is that, so what's the typical reaction to that? That kind of incident happens in a factory environment. What's the first thing everyone does? Oh, they put a guard on the machine, right? So you can't stick your arm in there. And I would go, well, that's all fine, but most of us know that sticking your arm in there is not a good idea in the first place. And I would venture that the person who stuck their arm in knew that too. This was not a surprise to them. So the question you've got to ask yourself is, what about the rest of the environment made them think that was a better option? Right? Was there a time factor involved? Is there a reward factor involved? Is there a peer pressure factor involved? One of the things about Disneyland, right? Disneyland's #1 operational core value is safety. Makes sense, right? You ask people to guess what it is, and most people will say, oh, it's about fun, right? Happiest place on earth. No, that's #2, and it's called show for them. It's all a show, right? Everyone's a player. Everyone's on stage. Safety's #1. And every single person at Disneyland, everyone is empowered to stop the show if safety is at risk. So that 18-year-old kid can shut the ride down if they think there's a safety issue, right? So they're empowered to do that. They know that that's a reasonable thing to do because they know nothing trumps safety. And one of the issues that we have in a lot of work environments is that we haven't actually taken the time with our core values to rank them in order of importance, right? Disneyland has. They have 4, ranked 1 through 4. I can't remember what 3 is, but #4 is efficiency, which is why they have all those, they put all that time and effort into how they queue and all those kinds of things. But they will forsake efficiency for the other 3. Yeah. And we need to know, all right, what in our environment trumps safety, if anything?
Yeah.
At what point can we go, no, we don't have to be safe because this is more important? Because when you don't know that stuff, you make terrible, terrible mistakes. Delta Airlines in the 70s had a small operational issue. That issue was that their planes kept falling out of the sky. It's a problem, right? And everyone would go, well, why is that happening? Clearly, the maintenance people are doing a bad job. But in actual fact, that's not why it was happening. The reason that it was happening is because their #1 operational imperative was what they called their on-time policy. In other words, every flight left on time, landed on time, and they guaranteed that to their customers.
Yeah.
So maintenance had to cut corners in order to get the plane off the tarmac. They knew what they were doing was wrong, but see, something was trumping safety. So this is the issue in most companies. There's something else that's making safety take a back seat. Find it and get rid of it.
I love that because I think so often, especially a lot of the case studies, webinars, everything that we sort of do when we draw in, you'll hear these organisations say the reason we have safety first is because if that comes undone, the rest of the business is done. Like we finished on with McCall's, and they said, look, if our safety measures are all humming along beautifully, the rest of the business is going fantastic. You begin drawing these sort of things in, and that's their lead. A number of them have these as their lead sort of indicators.
Yeah, and that's what we mean about being supported, right? So if it is safety first and you truly believe that, then everything should be putting safety first. But again, you look at a lot of companies, the rhetoric will be there, but the systems and processes say they're lying.
Actually, and that's a really good point. I remember talking with another fellow, and he made, as a measure, he says, how many companies talk about if someone sees something wrong, call it and stop it.
Yeah.
And everyone talks about that. And he goes, the hard part is, I go, so many companies, how many actually have examples where that's ever been done?
Yeah.
Because,
or think about, use a different example. Most of us have stayed in a hotel at some point. What you'll normally find at the hotel is there'll be like a little card or something, some sort of, survey to say, tell us how happy you are with our service or with the room, whatever it is. They want you to fill it out, and it usually involves ranking them from 1 to 10, that kind of thing. Right? If they truly valued service, if they truly valued you being happy, wouldn't the card just be, if you've got a problem, ring this number and someone will fix it? Right? Why would it be a survey? Why would it be something that you fill in and drop off when you're leaving? And how many hotels have you ever seen that? Have you ever seen a sign that says, if you got an issue, ring this number and we'll fix it? Pretty much never.
yeah.
So you have to question, how important is my satisfaction really? Is my happiness really? When I don't have that option. And this is,
Actually, I just reflecting on that when you said happiness, because you used an example where, was it one company's measure or something was around happiness?
Oh, yeah. So I've seen core values. Some of them. So one of them was the pursuit of happiness. And it's like, look, no one disagrees with that. I think we can all say, good one. Yeah, we're all on board. But then, values in a culture, values in a safety, it's a guide to behavior. So what exactly am I supposed to do? How am I supposed to achieve that? How am I supposed to show that I believe in that and that I'm working towards? Right? There's nothing. It's just nonsense. And you see a lot of this kind of, again, this aspirational feel-good stuff that doesn't actually have any kind of practical application at all.
Also, I guess on happiness, it's also then depends upon what makes someone happy as well as their interpretation. Like, if you love nice glass of wine, nice glass of wine makes me happy, so I'll have that at lunchtime every day. Might lead to another cup.
Just before you get in the car. So these are the kinds of issues. So we talked about your idea of safety, right? If you want people adopted, got to make sense, got to be compatible, got to be relevant, got to be beneficial, and it's got to be supported absolutely everywhere. But then when you look at the components of culture itself, remember earlier on I said there's 4 components. So one we've already discussed, which is values. And most companies have had a crack at that. Most companies haven't done a very good job of it. If you look at the definitions, they're not outcomes based, they're not measurable. A lot of companies haven't even bothered to define their values. They've just come up with a couple of nice words and left it up to everyone else to figure it out. And incidentally, if you want some help with that, reach out, because that's the kind of stuff we do. But there are 3 other things that need to be there, right? So if I'm saying that I've got this idea of safety and I want people to be safe, what does that ultimately look like in terms of the people? What do I want my people to ultimately be? If you look at a strategy, for example, strategy always has or should have some sort of vision for the organization, right? We want to be this. We want to go here. We want to achieve this. So I start looking at cultures and going, where's the vision for the people? What kind of people do we want to be? What kind of people do we want to have? Where's that? What am I working towards here? What are we trying to grow ultimately? That's never there. We have visions for organizations, but we never have visions for people. We have strategic intent, but we never have leadership intent. It's just left to figure it out for yourself. The other thing that I see missing in organizations is that we have the values. In other words, that we have here is a set of behaviors that we want you to buy into and adhere to if you join our company, right? Where's the other side?
The contract from them.
Yeah, here's what the company will do to support you while you adhere to those behaviors, right? And that's not money. That is literally what we're talking about here is going, well, how do we create like an employee promise, right? Where the organization commits to providing things for their employees in exchange for their adherence to those guiding principles. So guiding principles are a standard behavior for employees. An employee promise applies a similar set of standards to the organization. And there's your social contract, right? Because too often, again, it's always about the individual. It's the individual's fault. It's the individual's problem. As you know, we've been helping out some of your students who are working on making car parks safer and creating a campaign, and we've asked them a few awkward questions. And their initial thought was, well, we've got to tell drivers how to be safer in a car park. But stop and think for a minute. Car parks are inherently unsafe. That's the way they're designed. They're designed to be unsafe. There's not enough space. There's loads of blind spots. Originally car parks were fenced in. A park was actually a fenced enclosure for military equipment. That's originally what it was, right? The key thing being it had a fence around it. It was blocked off, right? So think about street parking. It doesn't have that.
No.
There's no barrier between you and the cars racing past you. So there's all these things that are inherently unsafe that we don't actually look at, and these are organizational issues. So if the organization is failing on the safety front, how on earth do you expect individuals to succeed?
I think that's a really interesting point, because I know one organisation, like the focus was we want to provide the safest fit for purpose vehicles for the drivers. And they got these fantastic vehicles, passed them all on. And then what happened is that this lady had the vehicle and she took it out from the fleet and she went along. And problem being, she was in the super safe 5-star U-Butte vehicle, and she's going down the freeway up in Brisbane, and next minute she's having to open her car door to let the temperature down because she couldn't work out how to turn the air conditioning or the cooling system or put the windows down, that sort of stuff. But she knew how to use the door, so she's opening and waving the door to cool the car down because she's stuck on a freeway. Now the thing is, the organisation found out of this because just so happened the police officer was following along behind them and went, actually, that's not cool behaviour.
Yeah, and this is the thing. And here's the other thing you should have some sort of leadership intent, some sort of vision that provides a consistent long-term focus in terms of what you want your people to be, how you want them to behave. You have your guiding principles, right? Your values. So they're the standards of behavior to which every employee has to adhere to. Okay. And that's a consistent philosophical and ethical approach that underpins all of your strategic and operational decisions. Should be everywhere. You then have that employee promise, which is the flip side of that. It's what the organization commits to providing for those employees in exchange for their adherence to the guiding principle. And this is the last thing. And I don't know that I've seen this anywhere. Every organization I've ever been inside has key performance indicators. Cool. All good, right? Where are the key commitment indicators? Where are the things that we're measuring and monitoring that tell us whether or not the employees and the organization are living up to their commitments from a cultural point of view, from a safety point of view, right? Where are they? Because most of the time, we're not actually measuring this stuff at all. We're measuring bad outcomes. We'll measure how many accidents we have. We'll put the sign on the wall saying, zero accidents this month. The word accident is another issue, but not well defined. So, as an example, accident has a couple of key things in its definition that most people don't understand. In order for something to be an accident, it has to be bad, right? It has to be a bad outcome, but it also has to be something that was completely unpredictable.
Yeah. That's why I use the term incident a lot more.
Yeah. So if you think about that, something that has an adverse outcome, usually where someone suffered some sort of injury, that was completely unpredictable. How many accidents do we really have? they're pretty rare, I would argue. You know, if I've had a few too many and I get in the car and I crash the car into a tree, that's not an accident. That was entirely predictable.
Um,
We,
I've got many of these lists I've bounced back from, and I think every one of my instances I look at going, that was all avoidable.
That's right. So you know, when you look at the components of a safety culture, you should have some sort of leadership intent. You should have these guiding principles. You should have this employee promise, if you like. You know, the flip side of that for the organization. And you should be having key commitment indicators. What's telling us whether or not everyone is following this idea of being safe?
And then I guess the everyone's also, like you said, there's the organisation side,
yep,
and the worker side as well. The commitment between the two of them.
Yeah, as we said to your students from Monash University, here's an interesting exercise. Go and find a car park designer. I bet you can't. I bet that job doesn't exist. Right?
Well, yeah. I know in Chadstone, I think the power is all that. The entire area is pitch black just to add to the mix. So you're like, everyone's driving around, it's just pitch black. I was looking at this going, how unsafe is this? And you're seeing people walking and they just materialize all of a sudden.
Yeah. But most of the time, it's again, go right back to the core issue here. Most of the time, the real problem is we haven't actually defined safety for a particular environment in the first place.
Yeah.
Right. You know, think about the zero accident type thing. You know, so does my paper cut count? Let's go for, oh, look, change that 0 to a 1, right? Yeah.
But depends how bad, like I guess.
But if you went into a factory environment and you did that, they'd all go, that was stupid. Of course not. No, that doesn't count. How am I supposed to know it doesn't count when no one's bothered to tell me that in the first place? See, we haven't told what we mean by accident. We haven't said what we mean by an injury. You know, where's the line? Why does a paper cut not matter, but losing an arm does? They're both a cut.
Correct.
Right? So this is why we say to people, you have to take the time to figure out what you really mean before rushing off to try and communicate it.
Well, I got a few interesting questions here as well, just to go through. So Jen made a really interesting here saying, some of the challenges we have in our prevention programs at WorkSafe are relating to changing behaviours of older workers. Any tips?
All right, so there's a couple of things that, again, you have to make this relevant. The issue you're going to have with a lot of older people is that we have a different definition, if you like, of safe for a start, right? We grew up in environments where we regularly swung on a jungle gym, you fell off, you broke something. That was the way it was. You know, there's a whole sort of environmental issue of how they grew up, what was considered safe or unsafe, what was considered, you know, particularly for males, manly and unmanly, you know, what you're supposed to just suck up and deal with, and what constitutes going to a doctor. We have this bigger issue with getting older men to go to the doctor, right? Because we all tend to soldier on and we won't do that. So you actually have to sit down with them and get them to talk about what safety means to them first. The biggest problem we have is that we're constantly telling people what we think safety means, and we're not taking the time to find out what they think safety means. And if you went the other way, you might find that you get to middle ground quicker. If you said to them, tell me what you think is safe or unsafe and why, right? So just take that time to discuss it with them. The other thing that I would say about older people, just something to bear in mind, is that most older people grew up with a single source of information.
Yeah.
One TV channel, one radio station, one newspaper they read to. So one of the things that they're used to is authority. So if you can find authority for those people, you can prove your case. And it's got to be a decent authority, right? You can use statistics, but they've got to be ones that they go, yeah, that's a fair source, that kind of thing. It's got to be something they respect. Then you can shift the dial with those people reasonably quickly when you can start to show them that kind of thing. The other thing you can do, which is why I said talking to them about safety and getting them to describe it rather than going the other way, it's important, is there's a thing called outsourcing a testable credential. And basically what it means is I've got to put the idea in your head and let you arrive at the conclusion rather than telling you. Ronald Reagan won an election doing this. His stump speech basically just went around the country and he said, ask yourself one question. Are you better off today than you were 4 years ago? That's it, right?
Genius.
If I answer yes, I'm not voting for Reagan, am I?
Yeah.
I'm voting for Carter. If I answer no, I'm not better off than I was 4 years ago. Now I'm voting for Reagan. And it doesn't matter what better off was. It doesn't, I didn't need to go into the detail. It's like, tell me what you're doing at work that you believe is safe. Tell me what you're doing every day that you don't think is safe. Why? So you've got to get people to confront these things themselves. Otherwise, it's just, it's a compliance exercise. It's a big stick. And again, they sit there going, but I don't do that. That's not relevant to me. We all do. This is one of the biggest problems with road safety ads, right? Where we try to shock people. We often do this. The problem with that approach is that it doesn't work for the most part because all it means is you're the closest spectator. It's not happening to you, it's happening to someone else. So we all automatically go, oh gosh, that's terrible, but that wouldn't happen to me. I'm not like that, right? The best road safety ads, and if you want to take the time, there's a brilliant one done on seatbelts by, I think it's the Suffolk County Council or something in the UK. It's on YouTube, you'll find it. Where there's not a car in the whole thing, there's not a seatbelt. All there is a bloke pretending to drive, sitting in his lounge room with his wife and daughter off to the side, and he's just doing this. And he looks over at them, and they're smiling, and it's just like this. And then his expression changes, and he goes this. He goes like that, right? Now the point is, even as I do this, what are you doing? You're imagining that. It's in your head now. You're not watching it. In order to understand it, you have to imagine it. The minute it's inside your head, then it starts to become real. And that's what we need to do more of in terms of communicating with people, finding ways to get inside their heads, finding ways to get them to think of these things rather than the other way around. Get them to think of the examples of how we could be safer rather than telling them.
And I think that's another great point. Like some of the case studies we've got is when, say there's been a company comes up with a great idea and the leadership goes, I'll put this technology, I'll add this to it all and we'll spend it and do it all. And they then outline it to the worker and the worker goes, yeah, that's great. I'll use it if you're around, but if you're not, I won't. And they go, well, what would you do? And they say, well, that's a good question. How about we do it? This is what I would do because it'd make my life easier as a driver. I can do this sort of stuff. And they go, oh, haven't thought of that. Well,
yeah, it's kind of like, you could say to a truck driver, do you think there's a period of time where everyone should take a break after they've been driving? Right? And their first answer might be, oh, look, I could drive all night, no problem. That's just the way I'm built. Yeah, I get that. But what about Barry? Oh no, Barry couldn't do that. Barry's not up to that. All right, so how do we get Barry? What do you think a reasonable time would be for him to just pull over and take a break? Well, maybe every 2 hours, 3 hours. Okay. Thing is, though, if Barry sees you not doing that, what's he going to do? Oh, yeah, Barry's always trying to keep up with me. It's the same when we drink, right? Drink him under the table every time. You see what you're doing? You're going, yeah, you're right. Yeah, we probably need a rule for everyone, right? Maybe Barry just takes a longer break than me, but as long as I pull over and take a little break, because I've got to set that. If you don't discuss these things with people, they don't get it. They don't see how this works for them. They don't see how it's relevant to them and to other people. So for some people, right, the safety thing is not so they can be safer, because there literally are people who can drive all night, right? They're not many, but
about
they do
4%,
exist.
3% of the population, they're very small.
Yeah, but those people exist, right? So they need to see that safety rule in terms of how it helps everyone else, because it won't help them. Right. So, and this is where we've got to be very careful about these blanket approaches, where we go, oh, well, everyone needs a rest, or everyone needs this, or everyone. No, they don't. There are people out there who are completely immune to COVID. No one knows why. Right. No one gets it. It's not that everyone needs a vaccination. It's that most of us do. And then there's a certain bunch of people who are influencers, and it's really good if you go first because people see you do it, they feel more confident. Even though you may not need it, it's better if you do it. And so on. There are different ways to appeal to people. And unfortunately, we tend to, we've got a nail and we take to it with a sledgehammer.
Bring that whole herd. So a couple of other questions. We'll just sort of come up the last sort of minutes when we are closing out in a tick. So if you have any questions, please shoot them on through. Carol Ann made a point here. I love the idea of rewarding safety, not making rules. I've seen mining companies totally change their culture by having a safety award every month that is a voucher to a local business, not a pub.
Yeah. And that, again, simple thing that you can do. Show that it's beneficial. Show there's an upside.
A really good one here from Jenny. Keen on your thoughts about leadership capability in the transport industry. My experience is leaders, management come through the ranks, e.g. a driver, and they have the technical experience and qualifications, no training of how to be a leader and to work with people and grow culture. Thoughts?
Okay, so I'm not going to comment specifically about the transport industry because I don't necessarily know enough about it, but I will comment in general and say that leadership, generally speaking, across the board is very poor. And again, I would argue it's because we don't really understand what the word is. I think it's a lot more helpful to think of leadership as a verb, not a noun.
Okay.
Right? When we think of it as a noun, the leader, right? We tend to think of it as something we can train, something that you can grow into, something that can be taught, and so on. When you think of it as a verb, it's all about what you're doing. It's who you are. The way to train to be a better leader, if you like, or to be a leader, is to become a better human being. Right? It's not. There are two things that define leaders generally when you strip away all the guff: self-awareness and communication. Most leaders fail on the self-awareness front. They don't understand enough about who they are. They don't understand enough about what they're good at, what they're not good at, and what they need to compensate for it. The communication stuff, we tend to focus way too much on the surface display stuff, right? So like being funny or using gestures or, you see it all the time with politicians. Remember Julia Gillard used to do this a lot. She goes like that. No one does that in real life, right? You had a mate at the pub and every time they wanted to make a point, they would do this. I'll put it up high and make it easier to see. You just sit there, what are you doing? Yeah, what are you doing? One of the mistakes they made with Julia was that they tried to change the way she spoke. Remember this. And because Julia wasn't particularly skilled in that regard, what ended up happening was that she just started speaking more slowly, and her accent became even more grating and more noticeable. What they should have done was change the way people listened to her. In other words, get her to emphasize, I'm a country girl. I'm Australian. When I get up to talk, I want everyone to know that I'm Australian. Because guess what? We had another Prime Minister who spoke in a very similar way to Julia, but took that approach and was immensely popular, Bob Hawke. They talk the same way. They have the same cadence. But Bob embraced it, whereas Julia was being told by advisors to try and get away from it. Just dumb. You have to be yourself. And the problem we have with a lot of our leaders is they're so busy trying to be whatever they think a leader is supposed to be that they've lost all authenticity.
Yeah.
That they've lost all sense of realness. And we every time they talk to us, we just glaze over because it could be anyone talking. Every time they write something, it looks like it could have come from anyone because most of the time it did.
Bro, I love chatting with you. Well, two questions. This will be the last one from our audience. So Kathy says, love the stuff, could listen all day, so much to unpack. Some highlights for me is company values are aspirational, ain't that the truth? Jumping on International Women's theme from last week, women have been doing it for eons, making the ideas seem like it came from a bloke, because you fellas just haven't realised it yet.
Yes, look, one of the things that I think is a massive missed opportunity is, again, diversity, right? Diversity should be about diversity of thinking. We tend to make it about gender, we tend to make it about colour, race, these sorts of issues. But really, the biggest problem we have in organisations is a lack of diversity of thinking. Look at boards, right? Yes, we know that there aren't anywhere near enough women on boards, but go further than that. Where are the musicians? Where are the scientists? Right? They have things that they could contribute to a company board. Why aren't they there? Why is everyone an accountant or a lawyer? Right? Because they only think one way. And we need much more diversity of thought. Because one of the other really unfortunate things that you see happening with women in particular today is that while we're promoting more and more women into positions, there is a tendency to promote the women who behave like the men in those positions. So again, we're not actually embracing everything that women can bring by being their natural selves. Greater sense of empathy, greater sense of caring, all the things that we think of as feminine traits, right? The business world tends to discount, tends to run away from. Most of the things that, there's a very interesting exercise where you can get a whole bunch of words and say them to people and just say to people, just want you to think male or female, right? So you go business and most people go male. You go coach and most people go male, right? Mentor, male, right? What do women tend to call their mentors? Do you know? It's really interesting.
No.
Friends.
Oh, wow.
Well, it's my friend. We have a lot of this. A lot of our language is very male-centric. English is also a very egocentric language. So for those of you who speak other languages, you may be aware of this. English, it's always about me. It's in front of me, behind me, beside me, below me, above me. Mine. There are indigenous languages, for example, that are not egocentric at all. They're all about the landscape. Up in the far north, there are indigenous languages that don't have a word for left or right. Everything's done by cardinal direction, north, south, east, west. Completely different way of thinking. Every 5-year-old knows where east is. Ask people who speak English to point to east, unless you're in a job like, shipping or something, most of us got no idea where east is.
Absolutely, and I love that, touching on some of the Indigenous and the First Nations, because once again, it's an entirely different perspective of how you engage them and bring them into culture and bring them on board.
Yeah, and here's the tip that I would give people. The one thing about Indigenous Australians, because there's no such thing as an Indigenous approach, but Indigenous Australians, time is important, trust is important. They operate on a different time scale, and you actually have to spend a lot more time with them, getting to know them, letting them talk to you, not the other way around. We work in the Northern Territory quite often, and a lot of the time, the first however many meetings, and it can last 6 months, is you're just sitting there listening. That's all you do until they start to feel that they can trust you. In an organisational environment, the one thing that I would say is most Indigenous Australians will have a leader within those environments. There will be a more senior person. Find them and spend that time with them, because if you can get them on board, quite often the others will follow. If our elder, if you like, has said this is a good thing to do, this is something we should do, it's part of the cultures. They don't question that too much. Cool. They'll get in behind that. So find the influential person and work with them. But like all things with culture, it takes time.
And I think it's an awesome way to close out, Brett. So one last question for you. If you could leave one thought behind before we close out in sort of 30 seconds, what would you say around our topic today?
I would say that our perspective is always that if you have to get the language right. Take the time to understand what you're really looking at, what you're really thinking about, and don't try to do it on your own. Come and get some help. You know, there are linguists around who can help you. They'll come in and get you to understand what it is you're trying to say and help you find a good way to say it. And just take a step back and go, well, what do we really mean by safety? What do we really mean by harm? What do we really mean by accident? What do we really mean by injury? All those kinds of things. Figure that out first, and then go do the cool stuff around how we communicate that to everyone else.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us today, Brett. I learn something every time we talk. I love our discussions. I hope our audience did as well. And also, thank you again for doing it twice. I do apologise. And thank you to our audience for joining us today, and the last one as well. It will be shared. We'll send out an email on Monday linking back to it all. So,
all good.
Have a great weekend. Thank you much, Brett.
All right. Cheers. See ya.
See you guys.